He spoke in riddles, but his final one ended in blood. Welcome to Silent Case Files. I am your host, Pendleton. Tell me where you're listening from. Your comments keep this mystery alive. I can't wait to read them all. Now the story begins. It was one of those damp and listless afternoons in October when the London fog descends in slow, ponderous sheets, muffling the sound of carriage wheels and turning street lamps into spectral orbs. I had returned from my morning rounds in Kensington to find Sherlock Holmes standing at the window of our Baker Street lodgings, his lean frame silhouetted against the grey pall of the city. He was, as ever, composed in stillness, though the twitch of his long fingers against the curtain edge betrayed an energy seeking its outlet. His violin lay untouched on the side table, and I deduced he had spent the better part of the morning in mental restlessness. The Times lay open upon the table, beside it a small notebook in which he had scribbled curious sequences of letters and numbers, as was his wont when bored. "Watson," said he without turning, "I deduce from your gait and the particular smear of mud upon your left boot that you have returned from Harley Street by way of the mews behind Thackeray's Lane. I should advise avoiding that route in future. There's a broken drain cover halfway down that has the potential to ruin your shine." "Remarkable," I muttered, instinctively glancing down. "And entirely correct, though how you— never mind." I dropped my hat on the stand and took my chair by the fire. "You've not stirred all day?" "I have been occupied, mentally if not physically," he replied. "But we are about to be disturbed. A client approaches." I raised my brow, but Holmes merely held up a gloved hand. "He wears square-toed shoes and a heavy cloak, walks with a pronounced limp, and carries, I believe, a bundle of papers in his left hand. How in heaven's name—" Before I could finish, the bell rang. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson entered, barely concealing her curiosity. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "From the Athenaeum Club, he says." "Show him in," Holmes replied, already clearing a space upon the desk. The man who entered was in his late 50s, with a thin, scholarly face, framed by iron-grey whiskers and gold-rimmed spectacles. Despite the stiffness in his leg and the moisture on his cloak, he carried himself with the air of a man used to quiet authority. "Mr. Holmes, I am Lionel Penworthy, keeper of manuscripts at the Athenaeum. I fear I bring you a most singular problem." Holmes gestured to the seat across from him. "Pray, proceed." Penworthy sat, clutching a sheaf of yellowing paper. "This concerns the death of my colleague, Mr. Isaac Fothergill. A curious man, to be sure, given to quoting obscure Latin verse and, in his later years, composing cryptograms in lieu of letters. But he was no enemy to anyone. And yet 1 week ago he was found dead in the basement archives of the club, collapsed at the foot of the spiral staircase. A tragic accident, the police said, but I do not believe it was an accident, Mr. Holmes." Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "On what grounds?" Penworthy glanced toward the hearth as if gathering courage. "On the day he died, Fothergill left me a riddle. A written riddle, as was his habit. He left it in my pigeonhole. I did not understand it at the time, but now—" He unfolded the paper and handed it across. "I believe he was trying to tell me something." Holmes took the page delicately. I leaned in to read over his shoulder. "Where ink runs dry and silence sleeps, the lion waits but never weeps. The 3rd of 9, the hand is turned. The fire will fall where page is burned." The room fell into a contemplative hush. Holmes tapped the paper thoughtfully. "Fascinating. And you say this was dated the day of his death?" "Precisely. The time was noted as 3:17 p.m. He was discovered just after 4, already gone. Cause of death? A fractured skull, The police believe he slipped while descending the staircase, but the floor was dry. He was a cautious man. He always used the railing. Holmes rose and crossed to the mantel, eyes glittering. "Tell me, Mr. Penworthy, were any manuscripts missing or disturbed?" "No, but his personal notebook, the one in which he kept his riddles, was not found on his person, nor has it been seen since." Holmes turned sharply. "A librarian whose final message is a riddle, and whose last act is to vanish a book of riddles. Yes, Watson, I believe we have the beginnings of a very peculiar case." He looked toward me with a spark in his eye that had been absent all week. "We shall call at the Athenaeum within the hour." And thus the game began. Holmes was already at the door by the time I had laced my boots. He had donned his Inverness cape and taken up his walking stick, though I knew from long experience that the stick was rarely for walking. With a brief nod to Mrs. Hudson, who hovered anxiously in the hall, we stepped out into the murk of late afternoon, the city's smog and drizzle lending our passage the dreamlike quality of a stage play behind gauze. As we walked, Holmes remained largely silent, eyes narrowed, the riddle from the librarian undoubtedly occupying the full theatre of his mind. I knew better than to interrupt him at such moments. It was not until we approached Pall Mall, the looming Corinthian facade of the Athenaeum Club appearing through the fog, that he finally spoke. "Where ink runs dry and silence sleeps," a reference to a library naturally, he said, mostly to himself. "But the lion waits, that is the key." "The British Museum?" I suggested. "There are lion statues flanking—" "No, Watson, the Athenaeum's own coat of arms, a lion passant atop an open book. Their reading room is famously silent, of course. This is no vague poeticism. Fothergill's riddle is specific, coded, yes, but precise. We were admitted by a solemn porter who seemed unimpressed by the presence of the world's most celebrated consulting detective. Mr. Penworthy, waiting in the lobby, greeted us with a nervous gesture and led us quickly through the vast entrance hall with its oil portraits of notable members, Darwin, Faraday, Dickens, to the narrow corridor that descended to the club's archive level. "The accident occurred here," Penworthy murmured, pausing at the top of a tight spiral staircase that disappeared into shadow. "There was no witness. A steward found him at the bottom, blood pooled beneath his head. He was pronounced dead on the spot." Holmes examined the railing, the worn iron steps, and the wooden lip of the floorboards where the staircase began. He knelt briefly, fingers tracing along the edge of the first step. "Not worn enough," he murmured. "This section is cleaner than the rest. Recently scrubbed." "A natural response to a fatality," I offered. "Indeed, but overzealous. It suggests urgency." Holmes turned and descended swiftly, the hem of his cape brushing each step. I followed less gracefully, ducking into the arched entrance to the archives, a long, windowless room lined floor to ceiling with oak shelves, each packed with manuscripts, folios, and codices of varying antiquity. The air smelled faintly of glue, dust, and the memory of smoke. Penworthy gestured to a spot near the end of the central aisle. He was found there. At the foot of the steps, head struck against that iron radiator. Holmes stood motionless, eyes scanning every angle. Then, quite suddenly, he knelt again, this time by a shelf, 3 paces from where the body had lain. He reached in behind a row of calfskin folios and withdrew something that made my breath catch, a scorched scrap of paper, brittle and browned. The edge was curled where fire had kissed it. "The fire will fall where pages burned," Holmes quoted softly. Penworthy's eyes widened. "That was not here when I checked the shelves after the incident. I swear it." "I believe you," Holmes replied, slipping the fragment into his pocket. "The book beside it is oddly placed, and the dust along the shelf's edge has been disturbed. Someone returned here recently." He turned and stepped back into the central aisle, then craned his neck to study the ceiling. There, directly above us, was a circular iron grate. "Ventilation," Penworthy supplied. "It runs from the reading room above." Holmes nodded. "Of course. Which means sound could travel down, carefully directed whispers perhaps. Mr. Penworthy, did Mr. Fothergill ever hold meetings in this archive?" "Only rarely. He was protective of the collection. He would descend alone most days, cataloguing or retrieving requests." "Then whoever met him here the day he died had a special reason," Holmes said. "And they departed without raising an alarm. That suggests familiarity, or at least subtlety." Holmes turned back to Penworthy. "Was there any conflict among the staff? Any professional envy, a contested promotion, or friction with club members?" Penworthy frowned. "Fothergill was odd, yes, a bit reclusive, but harmless. There was only one incident I can recall, though I hesitate to bring it up. It's little more than gossip." Holmes waited. "Well, about 2 months ago he was seen arguing in hushed tones with a club patron, a Mr. Archibald Blevins, a historian, bit of a romantic, always chasing obscure medieval codes. Fothergill had helped him track down some Byzantine scrolls, but something apparently went wrong. They stopped speaking. Blevins now works exclusively in the British Library." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Now we begin to peel the first layer." We returned to the reading room above, a vast chamber with a vaulted ceiling, lit by brass lamps and filled with the rustle of pages and the occasional cough. The club's silence was so complete that our footfalls felt like intrusion. Holmes walked its perimeter slowly, then stopped beside a marble bust of Cicero set in a recessed alcove. He tilted his head, reached up, and ran a fingertip beneath the ledge of the bust's pedestal. When it came away dusty, he smiled. "Watson," he said, "this is directly above the archive's ventilation shaft." "Which means someone could have eavesdropped?" "Or signalled," Holmes said. "We are not yet certain which, but that riddle was no idle verse. Fothergill had reason to fear, though not enough time, it seems, to name his killer outright." As we exited into the cloakroom, Holmes paused. "One final question, Mr. Penworthy. Fothergill's effects, what became of them?" "They were sent to his niece, Miss Clara Fothergill. She lives alone in a small flat in Russell Square. Quite devoted to him, from what I understand." Holmes tapped the brim of his hat. "Then that is our next call." Outside, the fog had thickened, and lamps glowed like amber ghosts in the gloaming. As we hailed a cab, I turned to Holmes. "You think she knows something?" "I think she may possess something," he replied. "And if I am right, Watson, it will not be long before someone else comes looking for it." "And if they find her first?" Holmes's face darkened, the lines around his mouth sharpening. "Then we must ensure that they do not." The hansom cab rattled through the drizzle-slicked streets as Holmes and I sat in silence, the fog curling past the windows like smoke from some unseen fire. Holmes had drawn his coat collar high and settled into that peculiar posture of intense inward concentration I had come to recognize over years of shared cases. I watched him in profile, the occasional flicker of thought animating his face like lightning behind cloud. Russell Square emerged from the haze as a quiet pocket of order in the chaotic sprawl of London. We disembarked near a row of well-kept but modest Georgian townhouses. Holmes consulted the address Mr. Penworthy had given, then strode briskly to a narrow stoop and rang the bell. The door opened moments later to reveal a young woman in her late 20s, plainly but neatly dressed in a grey blouse and long dark skirt. Her face was pale and pinched, not from frailty, but the look of someone shouldering a private grief. "I am Clara Fothergill," she said, cautiously, peering out at us. "May I help you?" Holmes removed his hat with a slight bow. "Sherlock Holmes, Miss Fothergill, and this is Dr. Watson. We were engaged this morning by Mr. Penworthy of the Athenaeum to investigate your uncle's death." Her expression shifted. An almost imperceptible flicker of relief passed over her. "I thought someone might come. Please, do come in." We stepped into a small but tidy parlour filled with the scent of beeswax and tea. A fire crackled low in the grate. Holmes's gaze swept the room with habitual thoroughness. A framed daguerreotype of an elderly man in academic robes, several shelves of books, many Latin and Greek, and a writing desk with a locked top drawer. "I must say," she began hesitantly, "I don't believe Uncle Isaac's death was accidental. The police were kind but indifferent. I tried to tell them about the things he'd said in the weeks prior." "What sort of things?" Holmes asked gently. She sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He told me he was being followed by someone from the club," he thought. "He didn't name them. He said it started after he refused to grant access to a certain manuscript, something he believed should remain sealed." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Do you know which manuscript he referred to?" "I'm not certain. He was very guarded, but I believe it was something in the Brackley collection. Private donations not yet fully catalogued. Some of them are quite old. One evening he came home looking shaken. Said he'd found one of the locked cases opened. And later that week he began writing riddles again. He hadn't done that in years." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "He left a message for Mr. Penworthy," Holmes said. "A verse." "Do you know of any others?" Clara hesitated, then stood and crossed to the writing desk. She unlocked the top drawer with a small brass key from her necklace and withdrew a folded page. "I found this the morning after he died," she said. "It was tucked into his personal psalter, which he always kept by his bedside." Holmes took the paper reverently and unfolded it. The handwriting was careful and deliberate. "In shadows cast by lion's breath, where ink was sworn and sealed in death, the serpent waits with silver tongue to sing the song that's never sung." "Cryptic," I murmured, but Holmes's eyes burned with intensity. He turned to Clara. "Has anyone else approached you about your uncle's things? Anyone inquiring after papers, letters, or books?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, yesterday. A man came, said he was from the club's archive committee, wanted to reclaim any items of club property my uncle might have taken. He had no papers, no credentials. I refused him entry." "Did he give a name?" Holmes asked sharply. "No, but he spoke with a curious accent, English but touched with something else, almost Central European." Holmes's brow furrowed. "And he has not returned?" "No, not yet." "You were wise not to let him in," Holmes said. "May I examine your uncle's belongings?" Clara led us to a small study adjoining the parlour. It smelled faintly of dust and cloves. A desk, a worn armchair, and several shelves of books made up the bulk of the room's contents. On the desk sat a thick notebook, half filled with neat handwriting. Holmes flipped it open and read silently. Then, "This is not the missing riddle book Penworthy mentioned. This is something else. Journal entries, observations. Ah, here. Watson, listen. Blevins persists. He feigns curiosity, but seeks the cipher. I dare not give it to him, nor let him know it has already been partially broken. I suspect he is not alone in this pursuit. The warning in Codex 13b confirms my fears. Someone else has read it. I must act." "Blevins again," I said. "More than a coincidence now," Holmes replied. "This cipher, this Codex 13b, is at the heart of it." Holmes moved to the shelf and scanned the titles. He pulled down a thin calfskin-bound volume marked only with a number on the spine, 13b. He opened it. The pages were covered in a cramped, archaic script. some Latin, some Greek, and a great deal of what I took to be an encoded language of symbols and interlocking glyphs. Holmes's fingers moved over the text like a pianist reading a score. Then he froze. "Watson," he said quietly, "look here. Someone has made pencil notations in the margins. See? Small, faint, but fresh, recent." I peered closer. "Translation attempts? Or cross-references?" Holmes muttered. "To another text. These numerals in the margin, see how they ascend irregularly? It's a cipher key, but if Fothergill had cracked it, even partially, that makes him dangerous. And valuable to someone who wanted what he knew." He turned to Clara. "Did your uncle speak of any threats more specific than being followed?" She hesitated. "Yes, once. He said, if they cannot decipher me, they will destroy me. At the time, I thought it was one of his riddles. But now—" Holmes was already standing. "We must go. I believe Mr. Blevins must be our next port of call." "And Miss Fothergill?" I asked. "She may still be in danger." Holmes paused, then turned to Clara with grave sincerity. "Miss Fothergill, I advise you not to—"
"Answer the door to anyone you do not recognize. If the man from yesterday returns, do not engage him. Lock the door. Watson, leave your revolver here with her." I blinked. My revolver? "She may need it more than we shall, and I dare say your hand has grown steadier since the war, but hers may have more cause to use it." With a reluctant sigh, I unholstered my old service Webley and handed it over. Clara took it with trembling hands but nodded. "I understand." "Good. Stay inside. We shall not be long. And Miss Fothergill?" "Yes." Holmes gave her a faint smile. "Keep the Psalter close. Your uncle chose it for a reason." And with that, we stepped back into the London fog, the mystery deepening around us like the dusk. The lamps were flickering to life along the edge of Russell Square as Holmes hailed another cab, his steps brisk with renewed urgency. We climbed inside, and the driver, after receiving terse instructions to make for the reading rooms of the British Library on Great Russell Street, flicked his reins and set off. Holmes settled back, fingertips pressed together, his gaze turned inward once again. He remained silent for the first several minutes, and though I knew his thoughts must be racing, his face was as unreadable as ever. Finally I ventured, "You believe Blevins murdered Fothergill?" "No, Watson," Holmes said quietly. "At least, not yet. I believe Blevins wanted something Fothergill refused to yield. Whether he resorted to murder to obtain it is the very question we must answer. But we are not chasing a common killer. We are moving within the shadows of intellectual obsession, a realm as dangerous in its way as any back alley in Whitechapel." "Obsession over an old book?" I asked. Holmes turned to me with a flicker of amusement. "You of all people, my dear Watson, should understand the power that rare knowledge holds. If this cipher truly points to some forgotten truth, something that has eluded scholars for centuries, it could ignite all manner of unscrupulous interest, especially among those who believe that secrets are more valuable when hidden than understood." The cab drew up before the grand facade of the British Library's reading rooms, and we alighted. The gas lights cast long shadows across the building's pillared entry. Inside, the vast silence of scholarship hung thick in the air. We gave our names to a porter and were shown to a modest oak-panelled study room where Mr. Archibald Blevins was said to be working. He looked up as we entered, a thin man with hawkish features, sandy hair slicked back, and pince-nez perched on a narrow nose. He wore a high-collared shirt with a blue cravat and fingerless gloves, despite the warmth of the room. His expression as Holmes introduced us was one of cautious civility, tinged with suspicion. "Mr. Holmes, I've read your monographs with interest," he said, extending a long-fingered hand. "Though I must say I hadn't expected to see you in my domain." Holmes accepted the handshake briefly. Indeed, Mr. Blevins, nor I you, though your name seems to have threaded itself into a most curious tapestry. We're investigating the death of your former colleague, Isaac Fothergill. Blevins's mouth tightened. Unfortunate, but I was told it was an accident. Some say so, but we have reason to believe Mr. Fothergill left behind a riddle that casts doubt upon that conclusion. A riddle you may well be in a position to interpret. Blevins gave a short, dry laugh. The man was obsessed with codes. He saw riddles where others saw routine. I respected his intellect, but he lacked perspective. Perspective? I asked. He grew paranoid, Blevins said with a dismissive wave. He was convinced someone was after his discovery, whatever that may have been. He claimed it concerned an ancient cryptographic method hidden in a forgotten text. But when I pressed for proof, he grew hostile. Holmes studied him. And yet you continued to meet with him? Only briefly. I had hoped to collaborate, but he refused, said I was too eager. Frankly, I began to suspect he never had anything at all, just the fantasy of an old man desperate for relevance. Did you ever examine Codex 13b? Holmes asked sharply. Blevins blinked. What? The manuscript, Codex 13b. You were seen consulting with Fothergill about it. There are marginal notes, notations we believe were added in recent weeks. He hesitated. Yes, I've seen it once. He showed me a page and spoke of serpents and silver tongues. Frankly, it sounded more poetic than scholarly. I never handled the text myself. And since his death? Holmes asked. Have you returned to the Athenaeum? No, I resigned my access shortly thereafter. There was a pause. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And yet a man attempted to retrieve items from Fothergill's estate yesterday, claiming to represent the club. Blevins's face remained still, but his right hand twitched ever so slightly. I know nothing of that, he said. If someone is impersonating a club official, it should be reported. Holmes nodded slowly, his tone cool. It shall be. He glanced at the writing on Blevins's desk, Latin fragments, tightly scrawled. Holmes leaned slightly forward, eyeing a page. May I? He asked, already picking it up. Ah, Augustinian text. Ex silentio veritas resonat. From silence, truth echoes. A fitting sentiment. He returned the page and straightened. Thank you for your time, Mr. Blevins. Should you remember anything at all, you may find it prudent to contact us. Blevins nodded. The mask of courtesy returned. I will. Outside, beneath the awning, I turned to Holmes. Well? He lied, Holmes said flatly. Not about everything, but about enough. He has seen the Codex more than once, and I suspect he took
something from it, perhaps a rubbing or transcription, but more than that, he knows the stakes. Did you see his hands? The gloves? Yes, Watson, but more precisely the fingertips, black smudges, ink perhaps, or soot. He's been handling something burned. My guess is that he recovered one of the fragments your Mr. Penworthy missed. That makes him dangerous or desperate. We were halfway down the steps when a voice called out from the fog. A shadow detached itself from the lamplight and stepped forward. A man in a grey coat, dark hat, and a scarf wound tightly across the lower half of his face. Mr. Holmes? He asked in a low, accented voice. Holmes stopped. Yes? I have a message. He handed over a folded slip of paper, then turned on his heel and vanished into the mist before we could react. Holmes opened the paper. The writing was familiar, the same tight, archaic hand we'd seen in Fothergill's notebook. The key is not the lion, but the shadow behind it. Beware the one who does not read, but remembers. The third fire will burn tonight. I stared at it, chilled. Another riddle? I asked. Holmes nodded grimly. Yes, and a warning. a very pointed one. What does the third fire mean? Holmes's eyes narrowed. First, the scrap of burnt paper in the Athenaeum. Second, Blevins's ink-black fingers. The third, I fear it may be yet to come. We walked in silence for a few paces. Back to Baker Street? I asked. No, Holmes said. We go to the Athenaeum. Now, I believe someone is returning tonight to finish what they started, and we must be there to meet them. He quickened his pace, disappearing once more into the night fog, and I followed, heart hammering, not from exertion, but from the deepening sense that the game we had entered was more perilous than either of us had guessed. The fog had thickened into a near impenetrable curtain by the time we reached Pall Mall again, the Athenaeum's facade looming like a watchful sentinel above the deserted street. The great doors were locked for the evening, of course, but Holmes had come prepared. From beneath his coat he produced a slim case containing a set of finely crafted tools, each designed for the most discreet of entries. I kept watch while he worked, and within moments the lock gave a soft click and yielded. The door swung open, and we stepped silently into the gloom of the vestibule, the scent of polished wood and old books wrapping around us like a memory. Holmes shut the door behind us with care and nodded to the corridor that led to the archive staircase. "We go below," he said in a hushed voice. "Our adversary will not risk the upper floors, not with the porters on watch, but the archives, especially after hours, are another matter." We moved like shadows through the club, the gas lamps along the hall having been extinguished for the night. Only the faintest light from the street filtered in, enough to guide our way. Holmes paused briefly at the top of the spiral staircase, then crouched to examine the floor. "Look here, Watson," he whispered. "Fresh prints. A man entered no more than an hour ago. See the fine grit left behind?" I peered down. In the dim light, I could just make out a faint trail of dust and mud, subtle but undeniable. "Let us not waste his generosity," Holmes said. We descended into the silence of the archive chamber. The door at the bottom of the stairs was ajar. Holmes paused again, this time drawing a small pistol from beneath his coat. I did the same, having borrowed a second revolver from Baker Street before we left Russell Square. Inside the archive, the air was close and musty. The rows of manuscripts loomed like silent sentries, and the darkness was nearly total. Holmes motioned for me to stay back, then glided forward between the shelves. From somewhere deep within the stacks there came the faintest sound, the creak of a hinge. Holmes froze. A moment later, a flicker of light, no more than the spark of a match, briefly illuminated a face. The man stood at the far end of the central aisle, his back to us. He held a lantern with one hand and a small parcel with the other. Holmes raised his pistol. "Stay very still," he said clearly. "You've led us on a clever chase, but it ends tonight." The man turned. For an instant, I thought it was Blevins, but then I saw the high cheekbones, the heavy brow, the oddly calm expression. He was younger, perhaps 35, with a thin moustache and foreign bearing. He made no attempt to run. "So," he said in a thick accent. "Hungarian, I thought, though not fluent." "You are the detective." Holmes stepped forward, keeping his pistol steady. "You were in Russell Square last night. You posed as a club official, and now you're back to retrieve what you missed." The man nodded. "The book." "What is it you're after?" I demanded, stepping beside Holmes. "The cipher," the man replied, as if that were explanation enough. "It was never meant to be read. Your Mr. Fothergill forgot his place." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You've read it?" "Enough to know what it contains." "You murdered him." The man tilted his head. "He fell, that is all." Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then, "What's your name?" The man smiled thinly. "Chris." It will not matter to you long." In a blur, he dropped the lantern to the floor. It shattered and sputtered, casting wild shadows as flames began to lick along the old wooden floorboards. At the same instant, Chris turned and ran. "Watson!" Holmes shouted. I raised my pistol, but Holmes had already dashed forward. Chris darted between two shelving units and disappeared. Holmes followed at speed, and I ran behind, heart hammering. The fire grew quickly, the dry air, the ancient paper. It was a devil's mixture. Smoke curled around the room, thick and acrid. "Holmes!" I shouted. No answer. I turned a corner and nearly collided with Chris. He had looped around, heading back toward the stair. I raised my revolver. "Stop!" He hesitated, but only for a breath. Then he lunged at me. We grappled. He struck me hard across the jaw, and I staggered backward. The pistol clattered to the floor. He made for the stairs, but Holmes was waiting. With a precise movement, Holmes tripped him, sending him crashing down onto the landing. Before Chris could recover, Holmes had him pinned. "Enough!" Holmes snapped. By the time I reached them, coughing from the smoke, Holmes had secured Chris's wrists with a length of cord from his coat. "I believe that's our third fire," Holmes said grimly. "Come, Watson, we need water and help before the archives become ash." It took nearly half an hour to extinguish the blaze. We summoned a night watchman, and a bucket chain was formed with the help of a nearby constable. In the end, the fire consumed 2 entire shelves of rare manuscripts, including, to Holmes's dismay, a portion of the Brackley collection. But the Codex, Codex 13b, was spared. Hidden in a protective case Fothergill had secreted behind a false panel. Holmes, ever the keen observer of precaution, had suspected its presence even before we re-entered the building. Chris remained silent as he was handed over to the authorities. He gave no further name, no statement, no plea. Only a single phrase uttered softly as he was led away. "Better lost to fire than found by fools." We returned to Baker Street shortly before dawn, soot-streaked and exhausted. Holmes tossed his coat aside and slumped into his chair with uncharacteristic heaviness. "Do you believe him?" I asked. "About the Codex? Its danger?" Holmes tapped his fingers together. "I believe he believed it. That is quite enough to make him dangerous." He stood, retrieved the surviving Codex, now locked in a small iron box, and set it on the table. "The question remains, Watson, what knowledge would a man kill to protect or burn to destroy?" I poured us both a brandy. "What will you do with it?" Holmes stared at the box for a long moment. Then he gave a weary smile. "Nothing for now. Let it rest. Some riddles are meant to be solved. Others," he said, looking toward the fire, "are better left unopened." I nodded. Outside, the sun had begun to rise over London, casting pale light through the dissipating fog. Another case closed, but with more questions than answers. Holmes sipped his brandy, eyes still on the Codex. "One thing is certain, Watson," he said finally. "We've not heard the last of Codex 13b. The days that followed were peculiarly silent in Baker Street. The fire at the Athenaeum made the papers, though only in brief. "Minor blaze in club archives," one headline read, neatly avoiding any mention of manuscripts lost or foreign agents captured. Scotland Yard had taken possession of the prisoner, though, as Holmes predicted, they gained precious little from him. Chris sat in his cell like a man content to have failed. No confessions, no outbursts, no explanations. Simply silence. Holmes, too, had become increasingly withdrawn. He spent hours pacing or seated with the Codex's iron box before him, locked and untouched. He neither opened it nor spoke of it. When I asked what he believed the cipher might conceal, he replied only, "Knowledge, possibly ancient, possibly poisonous, perhaps both." I suspected that the decision not to open it was tormenting him far more than he cared to admit. It was on the 5th day that a curious envelope arrived by hand. It was delivered by a page in the livery of the British Museum and addressed in a spidery script to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Baker Street. There was no return address, but the seal bore a sigil Holmes immediately recognized, the wax pressed with the image of a coiled serpent around a quill. He slit it open with care and drew out a single sheet. It bore a short message. The cipher was never meant to be broken, and yet one did, years ago. The trail ends not with fire, but with ink. Seek the widow in Ashgrove. A friend of Fothergill. Holmes read it aloud, then handed it to me. Ashgrove? I asked. Where is that? Surrey, Holmes replied, his tone suddenly focused. A small hamlet near Haslemere. Quiet, remote, but not without its ghosts. You recognize the handwriting? I do not, but I recognize the illusion. He stood abruptly and crossed to the bookshelf, withdrawing a slim volume. The Library of Forgotten Codes, a privately printed work from a Cambridge cryptographer, Holmes once assisted in a minor matter of academic theft. He thumbed through its brittle pages with quick fingers until he came to a folded sheet pressed between chapters. Here, he said, handing it to me. It was a faded letter, unsigned, in a different hand than the recent one. The ink had browned with age, but it was legible. To those who dare pursue the lion's cipher, know this. Its key lies not in the codex, but in the marginalia of the widow's prayer book. She saw too much. She remembered too clearly. They never forgave her for it. Holmes, I said slowly, you've known about the widow before now. I suspected she existed, but until today she was a ghost, a whispered footnote in scholarly rumour. Fothergill clearly corresponded with someone who knew more than he dared reveal. This confirms that she is alive, or at least was recently. And you think she holds the key to the cipher? Not just the key, Watson, the origin. Fothergill may have found the codex, but someone else placed it where he could. Someone who ensured it would not be understood too easily. The cipher is too ornate, too recursive, to be purely monastic. It bears the signature of human intention layered with deceit. And now this widow may unlock it? Holmes was already gathering his coat and gloves. There is only one way to find out. We arrived in Ashgrove just before dusk, the carriage rolling slowly through winding country lanes flanked by tall hedgerows and dark woods. The village itself was little more than a green and a scattering of homes, no more than 24 dwellings, a church, and a closed-down public house. We stopped before a narrow cottage at the far edge of the village, its windows shuttered, chimney emitting the faintest wisp of smoke. A sign nailed to the low gate read, Mrs. Bethany Harrow. Holmes knocked once, then again, softer. At last the door creaked open. The woman who stood before us could not have been younger than 70. Her hair, long and white, was braided down her back. Her eyes were dark and sharp beneath heavy lids. She did not look surprised to see us. "You've come for the codex," she said. Holmes inclined his head. "We come seeking understanding, nothing more." She studied him. "And you are Sherlock Holmes?" "Yes, I was told you might come. Come in then, but do not speak too quickly." Inside the cottage was warm and dim. A single oil lamp illuminated a room filled with books, more than I had expected. Volumes of scripture, yes, but also mathematics, astronomy, and history. On a small table beside a kettle sat an old, leather-bound prayer book. Holmes's gaze fell to it immediately. "That is the one?" Mrs. Harrow nodded. "The notes are in the margins. I made them when I was young, when I still remembered what he told me." "Who?" I asked. "My husband," she said simply. "Gareth Harrow, a monk once, At Abingdon Abbey, before it burned, he deciphered the cipher once before, and he regretted it every day that followed. Holmes remained still, letting her speak. He said the cipher was built to hide something, not treasure, not knowledge, but an idea, a philosophy older than the church, buried in books that were never meant to endure. Heretical, they said, dangerous, but he said it was beautiful too, pure, the kind of truth that unravels minds. She tapped the prayer book. After the fire, he hid these notes, passed them to me. I copied what I could before they came looking. I never knew who they were, but they knew what he had done. Fothergill found the codex, Holmes said. He must have come close. The widow smiled faintly. Close enough to draw attention. That was always the danger. They watch for patterns. Who reads what? Who asks the wrong questions? Your friend was clever, but not careful. Who are they? I asked. She shook her head. A name means little. They are not a cult, not a society. Simply the remnant of those who still believed the cipher must remain unsolved. Holmes stepped closer to the prayer book and opened it gently. Alongside the printed psalms were fine pencil marks, notations, arrows, symbols. She didn't lie, he murmured. These are mirror fragments of the codex. These marginalia explain the glyph structure. They point to sequences. He looked up, astonished. It's not a language, it's a code of memory, a system for passing knowledge without writing it down. Oral recursion nested in written structure. Gareth called it the Codex Ex Umbra, the book from the shadow, the widow said. It was never meant to be read by one man alone. The moment one man claims its meaning, he becomes a threat. That's what they fear. Holmes turned a page, then another, quicker now. It's astonishing, he breathed. Elegant, recursive. Fothergill was only scratching the surface. This is the rest. He gently closed the book. You've safeguarded something extraordinary, Mrs. Harrow. I've kept it from being misused, and I'll continue to do so. You must not take it. Holmes met her gaze with equal firmness. I won't, but I must understand it. Knowledge cannot be buried forever. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Then you may study it, but not here, and not alone. There are still eyes in this world, Mr. Holmes, and some riddles once solved do not go back into the box. That night, we stayed in the village. Holmes, sitting beneath the flickering oil lamp in our rented room, the copied marginalia spread across the desk. He did not speak. He only studied deep into the morning hours. I did not sleep easily. I dreamed of fire and ash, of pages turning themselves, of voices speaking in languages I could not understand, and through it all I heard the same phrase, repeated over and over in Holmes's voice like a tolling bell. Some riddles, once solved, do not go back into the box. It was just past 7 the next morning when I rose to find Holmes still at the desk. He had not moved from his place beside the window, where the first pale light of dawn fell across a scattering of notes and cross-referenced pages. His eyes were red-rimmed but alert, and though fatigue clung to his features, there was a brightness there, something between revelation and danger. "You've found something," I said, stifling a yawn. Holmes didn't look up. The widow was right. This isn't a cipher in the traditional sense. It's a mnemonic labyrinth, a codified structure for the preservation of knowledge through oral means. But what is most fascinating is that the written codex, the one Fothergill died protecting, is deliberately flawed. I stepped closer. Flawed how? Designed to mislead, he said. Certain glyph sequences are scrambled. Others are intentionally duplicated in misleading places. If you try to read it on its own, you end up following a false trail, one that circles endlessly back to the beginning. The marginalia in Mrs. Harrow's prayer book corrects the false paths. With both pieces, codex and prayer book, you begin to see the original framework. I peered over his shoulder at a page covered in diagrams, lines, and faint notations in Latin and Greek. Holmes continued, his voice low and precise. The sequences are designed to trigger conceptual associations intended for those trained in specific oral traditions, medieval memory palaces, rhythmic recitation, the kind of mnemonic practice once taught to monks in isolated scriptoria. It is less a code and more a tool, one that carries within it the structure of something never openly written. "And what is that something?" I asked. Holmes paused, finally looking at me. "A philosophy, Watson. One that predates organized theology. A framework of thought built on the rejection of imposed authority and the unity of perception and truth. It's esoteric, certainly, and incomplete in what we've recovered. But even the fragments suggest it was seen as a threat to those who preferred doctrine over doubt." I exhaled slowly. "You think someone revived it?" "I think someone feared someone might," Holmes said. Fothergill stumbled too close, and Chris was sent to silence him. Whether he believed in the danger himself or was merely following orders remains unclear. But one thing is certain, this knowledge was never entirely lost. Someone has been guarding it, perhaps even cultivating it in secret. A knock on the door startled us both. Holmes rose quickly, nodding for me to keep still. He crossed to the door and opened it only slightly. Mrs. Harrow stood outside, wrapped in a dark wool shawl. Her expression was grave. "I thought you should know," she said. "There was someone in my garden last night. I didn't see his face, but he left something." She held up a thin strip of parchment, yellowed with age and tied with red thread. Holmes took it, examined it briefly, and frowned. "He left it in your possession on purpose. He wanted you to give it to us." "I thought as much," she said. "Be careful, Mr. Holmes. Once you hold too many pieces of the puzzle, you become the puzzle yourself." He nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrow." She departed as quietly as she had come. Holmes closed the door and unrolled the strip of parchment on the desk. Upon it were only 3 lines of text. "He who recalls what was forgotten must forget what was recalled. The voice will speak again from the Iron Chapel." I frowned. "What in blazes is the Iron Chapel?" Holmes stood very still. Then slowly his eyes widened. "Of course," he murmured. "Watson, we must return to London at once." "What is it?" "An architectural riddle, cleverly veiled." He had already begun packing the notes and Mrs. Harrow's annotated pages into his case. "The Iron Chapel," he repeated. "A common nickname, though fallen out of use. It referred to a small domed hall, constructed of iron and glass, attached to the old printing wing of the Royal Society building on Carlton House Terrace. The hall was demolished in 1881, but the foundations remain. And you believe someone means to meet us there?" "Not us, Watson." The voice, he gave a grim smile. "I suspect the one who watched the widow's garden last night will return to the only place this riddle makes sense." The train brought us back to London before noon. By past, we were walking briskly through the streets toward Carlton House Terrace, weaving through diplomats, gentlemen, and messengers. At the edge of a disused courtyard behind the grand buildings of the Royal Society, we found the place, an old sunken garden partially overgrown and enclosed by ironwork gates. At its centre was a small stone platform, all that remained of the Iron Chapel. Holmes motioned for silence. We entered. At first there was no one. Then a voice spoke from the shadows, dry, deliberate, and tinged with accent. "You've brought the pieces." Chris stepped forward from beneath the arches, no longer bound, no longer guarded. I started, but Holmes placed a hand on my arm. "Don't move, Watson! This was orchestrated." Holmes turned to Chris. "You were released." "I was traded," Chris replied, "for information. The Yard didn't know what they had, but others did." Holmes studied him with open disdain. "You failed to destroy the Codex, so now you try another route." "I offer warning," Chris said, eyes fixed on Holmes. "You are too close. You see too much. Let it end here." Holmes raised the folded parchment from earlier, the strip Mrs. Harrow had received. "You sent this." "I was instructed to." "By whom?" Chris did not answer. He stepped backward. Holmes advanced. "What is your real purpose?" "To make you doubt," Chris said. "To make you question whether the truth is worth what it costs. The next fire will not be a library. It will be a mind." And then, just as swiftly, Chris turned and fled through the gate into the fog beyond. Holmes made no move to follow. I turned to him. "We can catch him?" "No," Holmes said. "We must let him go." "Why?" "Because his message is more important than his arrest. They want us to fear what we're learning. That means we're near something they still value." He looked down at the stone platform. "And this place, it was a nexus. The Iron Chapel was where rejected philosophies were debated before being silenced. This is not just history, Watson, it's theatre. They want us to see the stage and then step away from it." He looked up at me, his eyes unreadable. "But I won't." That night in Baker Street, Holmes placed the Codex on the table once more, beside the prayer book, the annotations, and the reconstructed diagrams. He stood before them like a scholar at an altar. He did not speak for hours. When he did, it was in a voice I had rarely heard from him, quiet, almost reverent. They tried to bury an idea by making it impossible to speak aloud, but in hiding it, they preserved it. They turned it into legend. Fothergill found the key by
accident. The widow protected it by memory, and now we hold it. And what will you do with it? I asked. Holmes looked at me with tired eyes, full of thought and conflict. "I will finish what they began," he said, "but I will not let it destroy me. Not as it destroyed them." He opened the Codex and began to read. The fire was low in the grate, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls of our sitting room at 2.1b Baker Street. Holmes sat at his desk, hunched over the Codex, the widow's annotated prayer book beside it, and a sheaf of notes growing thicker by the hour. The candles had burned low, wax dripping like slow tears, and though I had offered several times to relieve him or fetch food, Holmes waved me away with the distracted intensity of a man moving not through the world around him, but through some darker, older labyrinth of the mind. It was nearly midnight when he spoke at last. "Watson, tell me, do you believe knowledge can be dangerous?" I looked up from the chair by the fire where I had been reading a monograph on ancient ciphers, more to keep my mind occupied than for any real insight. "Dangerous?" I echoed. "That depends, doesn't it? Dangerous to whom?" Holmes turned in his chair, his face ghostly in the candlelight, his eyes ringed with shadow but sharp as ever. "To anyone who holds it, or anyone who fears it might be used." I studied him carefully. "You're speaking of the Codex," he nodded. "Yes, and what lies within it. I have finished cross-referencing the marginalia with the misdirected glyph patterns in the main text. It is... Watson, I cannot describe it as anything other than a map. Not a geographic one, a conceptual map. A recursive sequence of mental structures designed to guide a mind through a process of unlearning." "Unlearning?" "Precisely. The Codex systematically dismantles assumed truths. It poses riddles that cannot be solved by logic alone, but must be felt into place, demanding at each step the abandonment of received knowledge." "That sounds spiritual," I said cautiously. Holmes shook his head. No, it is anti-doctrinal, the very opposite. It contains no truths, only questions, and the deeper you go, the more you realize it is not trying to give you an answer. It is trying to remove your dependence on answers at all. He stood, his hands trembling slightly from hours of transcription. There is a reason people feared this knowledge, Watson, not because it contains blasphemy or heresy or secret rituals, but because it teaches the reader to dismantle structures, political, religious, moral, by attacking their foundations. It does not say, here is what is true. It says, what if everything you believe is only the shadow of truth? He paced now, slowly, deliberately. Chris and his unseen masters fear that question. Fothergill must have seen a glimmer of it and was silenced before he could spread it. The widow
preserved its outline, but this, he tapped the codex, this is the full path. I stood slowly. Holmes, forgive me, but I must ask, are you entirely well? He stopped. You think I've lost perspective. I think you've spent 3 days and nights immersed in something no sane mind was ever meant to fully grasp. He gave a short laugh, not mocking, but not mirthful either. That is what makes it so compelling and dangerous. He returned to the desk and held up a final slip of paper. There is one more message. It came by courier this afternoon while you were at the apothecary. He handed it to me. It was unsigned, written in the same hand as the others. You have opened the gate. Now walk carefully. They know you read. They know you understand. I stared at it, chilled. So they're still watching? Holmes nodded. Yes, and I believe they will soon act. They allowed Fothergill to go too far. They let Blevin stumble without reward. But me, Watson, I have seen it whole. And what will you do? He turned, and I saw now, not mania, but a kind of reluctant determination etched into his features. I will not run, nor will I bury what I've learned, but I will not spread it recklessly. There is a final step, a closing act. If this map is to be safeguarded, it must be done without arrogance. He drew a long breath and walked to the hearth. From his coat, he withdrew the iron box, the one that had carried the codex, and placed it carefully upon the coals. Holmes, what are you— I have committed it to memory, he said, calmly. Its structure, its riddle path, its recursive echoes, all of it. He poured a small measure of spirits over the box and struck a match. Flames sprang up at once, crackling and hissing as they licked the iron surface. It was never meant to be held by many hands, he said, and those who already know of it have proven what they will do to keep it secret. If I am to bear this weight, I will bear it alone. We watched in silence as the box blackened, then glowed briefly before the flames began to die down. I hope you're right, I said quietly, because if they come again, Holmes, they will not find what they seek, he said, and they will not find me unprepared. The embers flickered low. A silence settled over us, heavy and absolute. For the first time since the case had begun, Holmes looked, if not at peace, then at rest. The days that followed were eerily still. No further letters came. Chris vanished from the public eye. No charges were ever filed. No record of his arrest remained. The Athenaeum remained quiet, rebuilding its archive, and Mr. Penworthy politely declined to speak of Mr. Fothergill's eccentricities any further. Mrs. Harrow sent one final message. The mirror is buried. Let it reflect no more. Holmes filed the note in his locked cabinet without comment. 1 week later, on a grey morning, thick with fog, he emerged from his room dressed impeccably in his travelling coat and scarf. He carried only a small satchel. "Where are you going?" I asked. He gave me a half smile. "A holiday, Watson. Brief. Necessary." "May I ask where?" "To a monastery in the Pyrenees," he said, "where silence is considered wisdom, not absence." And with that, he was gone. He returned 3 weeks later, thinner, quieter, and possessed of a stillness I had never before seen in him. He resumed his work without delay, taking on 3 routine cases in as many days, each solved with his usual brilliance and complete detachment. Of the codex, the cipher, and the widow who remembered riddles, he never again spoke. But now and then, in the deepest hours of the night, I would see him pause beside the fireplace, his eyes distant, his fingers tracing patterns in the air. Patterns I had once seen in the margins of a prayer book, no longer in our possession, and I would wonder whether some riddles, even when burned, never truly ceased to speak. It was in the late autumn of that year, when the fog rolled heavier and the nights grew longer, that the past came tapping once more upon the windows of Baker Street. Life had resumed its normal rhythm, or at least the appearance of it. Holmes took on several minor cases, each solved with his customary grace and brisk finality. To the outside world he was himself again, the aloof, methodical genius, unmoved by sentiment and detached from superstition. But I, having shared his silence through long vigils and stranger revelations, could sense a difference. He no longer played the violin in the small hours. He rarely smoked, except when deep in solitary thought. And once, only once, I found him at dawn, standing motionless before the mirror, not adjusting his collar or cravat, but simply staring at his own reflection as though trying to recognize something he'd mislaid within himself. And then came the letter. Delivered not by post, but by hand, it arrived with no return address and bore no seal. Mrs. Hudson found it on the hall table, where it must have been slipped in during the early morning hours. She handed it to Holmes without comment, though I noticed the faint tremor in her fingers. Holmes opened it slowly. The paper was fine, unmarked, but the handwriting, a sharp, slanted script, was all too familiar. "The circle is not closed. What you remember remembers you. Come to the chapel of St. Hilarion. Midnight. No one else." He stared at the note for a long moment. Then he folded it, placed it in the inner pocket of his coat, and said simply, "We must go to Cambridge." St. Hilarion's chapel was barely a chapel at all. Nestled between the back halls of a defunct theological college and the edge of a moss-covered graveyard, it had long been decommissioned, its stone walls cracking, its leaded windows stained with ivy, and its door barred to the public. Yet, as with so many things tied to ancient secrets, it was not as forgotten as it pretended to be. We arrived under the cover of darkness. The moon hung low, full and yellow, casting pale shadows across the college green. Holmes had spoken little on the journey, answering my queries with silence or, occasionally, the faintest shake of the head. I had long since learned not to press him when he was in such a state. We reached the chapel a few minutes before midnight. Holmes examined the iron gate, then, finding it unlatched, pushed it gently inward. The chapel was dark inside, save for a single candle burning at the far end, its flame steady and still. The pews had long since been removed, leaving a bare stone floor and an altar that was little more than a block of crumbling masonry. A figure stood before it. He was robed, but not in any ecclesiastical garb, rather in a long black coat, high-collared and austere. His hair was white, though he moved with the bearing of a younger man. He turned as we approached, revealing a narrow face, eyes bright with the kind of fire that does not flicker. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice quiet but not weak. I had begun to wonder whether the codex had claimed you. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, "You sent the first letter, the one to Fothergill." The man inclined his head. I did. You're the architect of the cipher. A pause, then a smile, sad and deliberate. One of them. Not the last, perhaps not even the most faithful, but I helped lay its foundation. Why? Holmes asked. Why build something so elaborate only to bury it? The man walked slowly toward us, folding his hands behind his back. We once believed truth should be difficult, that only the worthy would reach its center. We were naive. Some truths, when uncovered too quickly, do not enlighten, they unravel. He turned to Holmes. You have seen that. I have, Holmes said, his voice lower than usual, and yet I am still standing. Are you? The man asked with no mockery. Then I offer you a final gift, a choice. He stepped to the altar and removed a small object, something wrapped in dark cloth. He handed it to Holmes without fanfare. Holmes unwrapped it. Inside was a second codex, smaller, thinner, but bound in the same archaic leather as the first. On its cover was no title, only a mark, a serpent devouring its own tail. What is this? I asked. The second voice, the man said. The codex you've studied is the map. That is the mirror, the echo of what lies beyond logic. Holmes held the object with great care. And why give this to me? Because I have grown tired, the man said, his tone laced with the resignation of decades. Because I believe you, of all men, may know when to read and when to stop. There was silence then, broken only by the distant tolling of a college bell. Midnight. The man turned and began to walk back into the darkness beyond the altar. Holmes called out after him. What is your name? The man paused, then looked back over his shoulder. I have had many, but the one Fothergill knew me by was Solomon. He never knew if it was real. He vanished into the shadow, and we were alone. We returned to Baker Street without speaking, the second codex wrapped again and sealed within Holmes's satchel. He placed it on the mantel and poured himself a measure of brandy. You are not going to read it? I asked at last. Holmes stared into the glass, his fingers curled loosely around the stem. Not yet, perhaps not ever. But surely, after all this, you must know what it contains. I do know, Watson, he said quietly. That's what frightens me. He drank, then lowered the glass and stood. The mind is like a lock. Some keys open too many doors, and some doors open only once. He turned to the fire, and the candlelight played across his face like light through stained glass. Refracted, fractured, but strangely beautiful. And I, seated across from him, wondered, as I had not dared to since the day we first stepped into the Athenaeum, whether this was still the same Holmes I had known, or whether some fragment of the cipher had taken root within him. He turned to me, a wry smile on his lips. Do not worry, Watson. I remain your friend and the world's most reluctant philosopher. But I saw it, the tension behind his eyes, the weight of something far older than us both pressing on the edge of his reason. Some riddles, I now understood, do not seek solutions, they seek hosts. It was the sound of pages turning that woke me. Faint, rhythmic, unmistakable. At first I thought it was part of a dream, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light of early dawn, I realized the source was real and very near. I rose from the settee in our sitting room and saw Holmes at his desk, illuminated only by the flickering glow of a candle that had burned deep into the wax. His posture was still, shoulders hunched, long fingers resting on the edges of an open book. The second codex. I moved quietly to his side. Holmes. He did not startle, but he glanced up as though only just remembering I existed. There was no disarray in his appearance, no wildness of a man consumed by obsession, but there was something else, a strange calmness, like a deep, stillness at the center of a storm. "I had to see," he said softly. "Just the first few pages, to understand whether it was merely an echo or something new." "And?" I asked cautiously. He gestured to the open codex. Its pages, unlike the original, bore no glyphs, no spirals of ancient symbols or faded annotations. Instead, it was filled with dense lines of text, paragraph after paragraph, in immaculate Latin. "But it's readable?" I asked, astonished. Holmes nodded. "Yes, it appears so, but it reads like a mirror, not a reflection of the first codex's content, but a response to it, almost as if one manuscript questions the other." He leaned back, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "It begins with a meditation on forgetting, then proceeds into paradox. Each passage disassembles the logic of the previous one, not to confuse, but to challenge. It's a dialectic, Watson, a dialogue. With the first codex," he gestured to the hearth where the original had been burned, "it assumes I have already read what no longer exists, and yet somehow it knows what that was." "That's impossible," I said. "Is it?" Holmes replied, almost wistfully. "Or is it precisely what the architect Solomon intended, a sequence not of knowledge but cognition?" He stood, pacing slowly. "This second book is not a continuation. It is a trapdoor. The first one teaches you to question the world. This one teaches you to question the part of yourself that asked." I stood too, unsettled. "And where does that lead?" Holmes stopped by the window, looking out onto Baker Street, which was just beginning to stir with mourning carriages and costermongers setting up stalls. "Nowhere. Everywhere. It ends in silence." A knock at the door interrupted the heavy air between us. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed. "Telegram for you, Mr. Holmes?" He accepted it without a word and opened it quickly. I watched his expression as he read. He handed it to me. "From C. Fothergill. Stop visitor. Came at night asking for the prayer book. Stop said he was from Royal Society." "Stop," I said. I no longer had it. "Stop." He smiled. "Left a name." "Solomon. Stop, what does it mean?" Holmes was already dressing as I read. "She is being watched," he said. No doubt they suspected she still held some piece of the puzzle. "But Solomon was with us. We saw him," I protested. "We saw Solomon. Or rather, we saw the man who chose to wear that name. It may be a cipher in itself, a mantle passed between guardians of the Codex." He paused, mid-buttoning his coat. "Or worse, it may be the name anyone uses when testing the boundaries of knowledge they ought not cross." He turned to me. "We must go to her, but not to protect her. She's safer now than we are. We must ask her." "Ask her what?" "Whether she still remembers the original codex, not the symbols or the riddle, the shape, the path. Because if she does, then they will not stop until the final ember of that knowledge is snuffed out." Clara Fothergill's flat in Russell Square had been undisturbed, at least on the surface. But Holmes moved from corner to corner with practiced precision, tracing the edges of her carpet, examining the window ledge for scratches, scanning the bookshelf. "Someone searched this place," he said. "2 nights ago, I suspect, likely while she slept." Clara sat beside the hearth, pale and composed. She had aged a year in the week since we last saw her. "I didn't wake," she said quietly. "I only found the back window open, no footprints, no sign of forced entry, just a feeling, like the room remembered someone I didn't invite." Holmes crouched before her. "And the prayer book?" "Gone," she said. "I burned it. After the first visit from Chris. I didn't tell you because I thought it was over." He gave a slow nod. "Perhaps it was, until the second codex appeared." She looked at him carefully. "You opened it?" "I did." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And did it speak back?" Holmes's eyes didn't flinch. "Yes, it did." Clara closed her eyes. "There was one more riddle," she said. "Uncle Isaac told me once, long before any of this began. I'd forgotten it until now." She reached into a drawer and withdrew a folded piece of yellowing paper. It had been tucked inside the spine of a family Bible. She handed it to Holmes. He read aloud, "The door is not the threshold. The key is not the lock. When the reader becomes the page, the book will close itself." He folded the paper slowly. "This wasn't a riddle," he said. "It was a warning." That night, back in Baker Street, Holmes wrote a letter by hand. I had never seen him choose his words so carefully, each line measured as though he were penning a final confession. When he finished, he sealed it and addressed it simply, "To be opened only if I am no longer myself." He placed it in the drawer of his desk and locked it. Then he turned to me. "I am going away, Watson." I stood. "Again?" "This time I do not know for how long, nor even quite where, but somewhere the Codex cannot find me, nor those who follow it." "You think they're still watching?" "They always have been," he said, "but now they're listening too, and I have said too much." He placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. "You are the last man I trust. If they come for me, if I return, and I am not who I was, then you must read the letter and do what must be done." He gathered the Codex into his satchel and left before I could argue. I have not seen Holmes since that night. Weeks passed, then a month, no letters, no telegrams, only the echo of pages turning in the silence he left behind. And still I have not opened the letter, not because I fear what it may say, but because I fear that if I do, I will no longer be reading about the Codex. I will become part of it, a page in a book that writes itself. And like Holmes, I may never close it again. It was a grey February morning, windless, cold and still, when I received the telegram from S.H. "Stop, the path is sealed. Stop, come to Montreux. Stop, the final piece is yours to hold. Stop, Montreux, Switzerland." A small town along the shores of Lake Geneva, nestled beneath snow-dusted hills. I packed at once, my hand trembling not with cold, but with relief. For nearly 3 months I had heard nothing from Holmes, no whispers, no rumours, no sightings. I had feared the worst, that he had succumbed not to enemies of flesh and blood, but to the quiet erosion of the mind, the kind that comes when one stares too long into riddles no man was meant to solve. I arrived late in the evening, the lake black and glassy under the weight of moonlight. Holmes was waiting at the station platform. He wore no disguise, no false beard or foreign accent, only his long grey coat, his hat tilted slightly against the wind, and that familiar measuring expression I knew so well. "Watson," he said, as though no time had passed. I grasped his hand, unable to hide the emotion in my voice. "Holmes, thank God." He gave a faint smile. "There's nothing divine about it, I'm afraid. Merely timely deduction." We walked together through the quiet town to a modest villa overlooking the water. Inside, a fire crackled, and tea had already been laid. On the desk was the second Codex, but it was closed, its cover marked now with a red ribbon. "I have not opened it since the day I left Baker Street," Holmes said, "nor do I intend to." I stared. "But surely, after all that's happened—" Holmes nodded, pouring the tea. "Yes, I read just enough to understand what it was, and more importantly, what it was not." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Let me tell you what I have come to believe, Watson, and then you may judge whether this case has ended in victory or surrender." I listened, as I always had, notebook in hand. "The Codex, the entire structure of the cipher, was never about forbidden knowledge," Holmes began. "It was a test, not of intellect but of restraint. Each layer presented new truths, yes, but also new temptations. The moment you accepted one interpretation, The Codex offered another. It trained the mind to question itself, endlessly. I nodded slowly. You said once it was recursive. Indeed, but recursion without termination is not knowledge, it is collapse. I saw men like Fothergill try to grasp it, only to lose themselves. And Chris? He feared not the content, but the effect. He had already been touched by it. That's why he spoke in warnings, not doctrine. And Solomon? I asked. Whoever he truly was? Holmes's eyes grew distant. He was a guardian, or perhaps merely a placeholder, in a long line of such men. He was part of a tradition that believes certain ideas must be preserved, but only in fragments, never whole. I stared into the fire, digesting it all. Then what was the purpose of it? Why go through so many layers to preserve what amounts to an exercise in restraint? Holmes smiled faintly. Because, Watson, power doesn't lie in possession, it lies in the choice not to possess. The Codex was a mirror. If you could look into it and not be consumed, if you could learn to walk away, you had passed the final riddle. He rose, crossed to the desk, and placed a hand on the Codex's cover. I have solved many mysteries in my life, some with logic, others with luck. But this one asked not what I knew, but what I could let go. He turned to me, and for the first time I saw in him not detachment, but peace. Tell the world, if you must, that the case was closed by fire, or that the Codex was lost in flight. But leave out the temptation. Let the story end where it should, with silence. I stood, understanding. And the letter? I asked. The one you left in Baker Street? He nodded. Burn it. It was written by a man afraid of himself. I am no longer that man. We remained in Montreux for 3 more days. Holmes rested more than I had seen him do in years. We walked along the lake, drank coffee with local scholars, and spoke of trivialities, music, chess, rare orchids. Not once did we speak of the Codex again. On the morning of our departure, he handed me the red-ribboned volume. You will keep it? I asked. He shook his head. You will. I opened my mouth to protest. Not to read, he said gently, to protect, and when the time comes, to bury. And with that, Sherlock Holmes turned from the lake, the Codex, and the final shadow of the greatest riddle he had ever faced. Years have passed. I have kept the Codex as promised, sealed, unread, untouched. It rests in a box beneath a floorboard, beneath another box marked simply Misc. Notes, I have never opened it. But some nights, when the wind is right and the candlelight flickers strangely, I think of Holmes and the mirror he stepped away from. I think of Fothergill's riddle. I think of doors that are not thresholds. And I wonder, just briefly, what might happen if I read the first line? But I never do, for some mysteries are not puzzles to be solved. They are questions we choose never to ask. And in that choice lies the final, and perhaps only, solution.